Welcome to the deep dive.
Glad to be here.
Today we're diving into the perspectives of Willy Wimmer. He's a significant figure in German political history, especially on security policy.
Yes, a long career. And you've got a really interesting mix of sources for us to look at.
We do. There's biographical info, some media analysis, both critical and more supportive, and this key letter he wrote to Chancellor Schröder.
So our mission really is to unpack his views, try to understand the context behind them, especially his, let's say, often contrarian takes on things.
Exactly. And we have insights from established media, but also from alternative sources he engaged with, plus his own words to the Chancellor. It gives a pretty rounded picture.
It should.
And for you, our listener, what's really fascinating here, I think, is revisiting his early warnings about surveillance, stuff people basically dismissed at the time.
Yeah, but events later gave them a kind of chilling relevance, didn't they?
They really did. We'll also look at his firsthand account of a NATO exercise, a pretty shocking one involving simulated nuclear attacks on German cities.
Right, that Wintex exercise, quite a story.
And then there's his perspective on how the U.S. exerts influence in Europe, particularly based on that letter. So yeah, lots to get into.
Definitely.
Okay, so let's start with the basics. Willy Wimmer, the man, his background, his political path.
Okay. So born in 1943, he was a member of the CDU, the Christian Democratic Union, a major party,
Right.
studied law and political science, so he had that academic grounding. Then a long stint in the German parliament, the Bundestag, from 1985 right up to 2009.
That's a substantial period, and he wasn't just a backbencher, was he? He held some key roles.
Oh, exactly. He was parliamentary state secretary in the Ministry of Defense from 88 to 92.
Which must have been an absolutely critical time. You've got the Berlin Wall falling, German reunification.
Absolutely. Integrating the East and West German forces, dealing with the Soviet troops leaving, the transition to the CIS, it would have been incredibly complex.
So he was right in the thick of it, dealing with the practical side of huge geopolitical shifts.
Definitely. And later, he was vice president of the OSCE Parliamentary Assembly from 94 to 2000. So, involved in international security on a broader stage, too.
And even after leaving office, he kept engaging, didn't he? Through writing, media appearances.
Yes, the sources show he remained quite active, voicing his opinions on security and international affairs.
Which brings us neatly to one of the core themes, his often critical stance on U.S. and NATO policy. That seems to be a consistent thread, particularly later on.
It really does. His general view seems to be pretty skeptical of U.S. foreign policy, and he consistently argued for Europe to be more independent.
More autonomous.
Yes. There's that interview with Young Welt where he calls cooperation with the EU and NATO life-threatening for Europe. That's very strong language.
Life-threatening. Wow. It shows the depth of his concern, I suppose.
It does. And it wasn't just abstract theory. He had specific criticisms, like the sanctions against Russia.
Yes. He called those one of the greatest follies, didn't he?
Okay.
Driven by U.S. pressure, in his view.
Exactly. That gets right to his central argument, that European decisions are often shaped more by Washington's agenda than by what's best for Europe itself.
Which, challenges the whole narrative of the transatlantic alliance as always being perfectly aligned.
It does. It taps into that feeling some have that Europe needs its own voice, its own path, prioritizing its own stability, even if that sometimes means disagreeing with the U.S.
Okay, let's shift gears slightly to something that feels incredibly relevant today, surveillance. The sources mention his early warnings.
Right. The Frankfurter Rundschau piece recalled this during the whole NSA scandal.
What exactly was he saying back then?
Well, things like, careful, the CIA's listening, and apparently joking that the only safe place for a phone was inside a refrigerator.
Okay. A bit hyperbolic maybe, but...
But at the time, people apparently just ridiculed him for it, laughed it off.
And then years later, Snowden happens and suddenly doesn't seem so far-fetched.
Precisely. It really makes you think, doesn't it? How often are early warnings, maybe ones that sound a bit out there, dismissed until it's too late?
It's a good point. And it certainly adds a layer, in hindsight, to his critiques of Western power structures. But we also need to talk about where he chose to voice these critiques later on.
Yes, the media collaborations. This is where it gets quite controversial.
Tell us about that. Which outlets are we talking about?
Well, the sources mention him writing for Compact magazine, which German authorities have classified as secured extremist.
Okay, that's significant.
He also spoke at a Compact conference in 2014, wrote for Kopf Verlag, which is known for conspiracy theories and right-wing content, and then appearances on Iranian state TV, RIB, and Ken FM.
Ken FM, that YouTube channel that was also under observation by German intelligence.
That's the one. So yes, these are definitely not mainstream platforms.
And predictably, this drew a lot of criticism.
Oh, absolutely. Volker Beck from the Green Party called on the CDU to clarify its stance on Wimmer, calling him and others right-wing populist conspiracy theorists. There were calls to reconsider his honorary party status.
So it raises difficult questions about association, platforming.
It really does. His defenders might say, well, maybe the mainstream wasn't listening, so he went where he could get his message out.
But the critics would argue associating with such outlets lends them legitimacy.
Exactly. It highlights that whole complex issue of dissenting voices and where they find an audience in today's media landscape.
It's definitely complex because there is also, as the sources note, a defense of Wimmer's underlying positions, right? It's not just about the controversial platforms.
That's true. Supporters argue you need to see his criticisms in a wider context. His desire for European independence, for example, isn't an isolated view. Others share that kind of sentiment.
The argument being that the U.S. naturally looks after its own interests first.
Which don't always neatly overlap with European interests. So a bit of critical distance, pushing for more European sovereignty, that's seen by some as perfectly legitimate, even necessary.
Right. And what about his stance on Russia?
His supporters would highlight his emphasis on dialogue, on cooperation with Russia, rather than just confrontation. That resonates with parts of the European public who are maybe wary of escalating tensions.
So he's seen by some as someone challenging the official line.
Yes, particularly by those already critical of the political establishment. He offers alternative perspectives they feel are missing from the mainstream conversation. His use of alternative media could be seen through that lens, too, trying to represent viewpoints he felt were being ignored.
Okay, let's move to that NATO exercise you mentioned earlier, Wintex, in 1986. This sounds like a pivotal moment.
It really does sound extraordinary. Wimmer was acting defense minister at the time, participating in this exercise in the government bunker, Marienthal.
And what happened?
According to Wimmer's account, NATO headquarters in Brussels requested German consent for a simulated nuclear strike.
A simulated strike. Where?
On Dresden and Potsdam. In East Germany at the time, but still German cities.
Wow. Even simulated targeting German cities in a NATO exercise.
That's all.
Startling. How did Wimmer react?
He refused. He reportedly said he wouldn't participate in planning any kind of nuclear attack, even a simulated one, on German territory.
A flat refusal.
Yes. And apparently, Chancellor Helmut Kohl backed him up. Kohl ordered the German representatives to pull out of the exercise immediately.
And the exercise just continued without them.
That's the account, yes. It went ahead without German participation in that part of the planning.
That's an incredible story. Taking that stand, it says a lot about his views on sovereignty and perhaps his reservations about NATO's potential actions, especially involving nuclear weapons on German soil.
It certainly seems to mark a significant moment, highlighting those tensions between alliance commitments and fundamental national interests, particularly when you're talking about the ultimate weapon.
Okay, let's connect this to the other major piece of evidence we have. That letter Wimmer wrote to Chancellor Schröder in 2000.
Right after attending that conference in Bratislava.
Co-hosted by the U.S. State Department and the American Enterprise Institute. Focus: Balkans NATO expansion. This letter feels like a direct window into his thinking about U.S. strategy.
It really does. He lays out quite meticulously what he perceived as the key takeaways and underlying aims discussed there. And his interpretation is deeply critical of the American approach.
What were some of the key points he reported?
Well, first, a demand for quick international recognition of an independent Kosovo.
Okay.
And alongside that, an assertion that Yugoslavia, the Federal Republic of Yugoslavia, was essentially outside any legal order, specifically outside the Helsinki Final Act.
The Helsinki Final Act being the agreement that guaranteed the inviolability of post-war borders in Europe.
Exactly. So Wimmer saw this as a move to bypass foundational principles of European security. He also reported a view expressed there that European law was actually an obstacle to NATO.
And Austin.
Yes, and that American legal thinking was more suitable for applying in Europe. That directly feeds his concern about U.S. dominance overriding European legal norms.
He also mentioned something about revising Eisenhower's decisions after World War II.
Yes, quite a striking claim. He reported the idea that the war against Yugoslavia was partly about correcting Eisenhower's decision not to have Western forces occupy the Balkans, and that a U.S. troop presence there was now seen as strategically necessary.
That's a bold reinterpretation of history and motives.
It is. And Wimmer's take was that European allies went along with the Yugoslavia intervention partly to resolve a dilemma within NATO, the gap between its new out-of-area strategic concept and their own preference for UN or OSCE mandates.
So he saw it as setting a precedent.
He did. He argued that even though Europeans tried to frame Yugoslavia as a one-off, an exception, the American view, as he perceived it at that conference, was that it clearly set a precedent for future interventions without a UN mandate.
And the goals for NATO expansion itself, as he described them from that meeting, they sounded incredibly ambitious.
Hugely ambitious. He reported the aim was to restore the whole area between the Baltic Sea and Anatolia, Turkey, to something like the geopolitical situation under the Roman Empire.
Like the Roman Empire. That's quite an analogy.
It implies a vast sphere of influence, doesn't it? He listed specific goals, too. Poland to be surrounded by democratic neighbors, Romania and Bulgaria securing the land bridge to Turkey, Serbia to be permanently excluded from European development.
Excluded? Why?
Likely, in Wimmer's interpretation, to guarantee a justification for a continued U.S. military presence in the Balkans.
Okay. And what else?
Gaining control over Russia's access to the Baltic Sea north of Poland. Essentially, he saw it as a strategy to cut Russia off from the Baltic, push it further out of Europe.
It paints a picture of a very deliberate, long-term strategy to reshape Eastern Europe's entire map. And there was something about self-determination, too.
Yes, he reported an emphasis on the right to self-determination, taking precedence over all other international law provisions. He linked this to Wilsonianism, President Wilson's ideas.
And he saw that as dangerous.
He saw it as potentially very destructive for Europe, something that could be used to break up existing states based on minority claims. And maybe the most chilling part for him.
Yes.
He said the assessment made at the conference that NATO had violated international law in Yugoslavia met with no contradiction from the American participants, implying they knew and essentially didn't care if it stood in the way of their goals.
So Wimmer's conclusion in that letter to Schröder was stark.
Extremely stark. He believed the U.S. side was consciously trying to dismantle the post-World War II international legal order to achieve its aims. Power before law. International law disregarded if inconvenient.
He even compared it to the lead-up to World War II.
Yes, the failure of the League of Nations. He called that kind of self-interest totalitarian. A very, very strong condemnation based on what he heard or perceived at that conference.
Okay, let's try and pull these threads together as we wrap up this deep dive. We've covered Willy Wimmer's long political journey.
His persistent critiques of U.S. and NATO policy that drive for European independence.
His warnings about surveillance, which seemed outlandish then, but not so much now.
That really shocking account of the Wintex NATO exercise, the simulated nuclear attack.
And his detailed critical analysis of American strategic thinking, particularly from that Bratislava conference letter.
Yeah, quite a landscape of perspectives. It's worth thinking about those specific points again. The implications of simulating nuclear war on your own allies' territory, even in the Cold War context.
Right. And the claim that international law was being consciously sidelined for geopolitical gain, that's a huge accusation.
It is. And then just remembering how those surveillance warnings were initially treated compared to how we see things now.
Which leads us to a final thought for you, listening. When you consider Wimmer's claims about the push to reshape Europe, control strategic points, maybe sideline international law, how do these historical perspectives, his perspectives, inform how you see today's geopolitical tensions?
How do they color your understanding of the debates about national sovereignty versus being part of big international alliances?
What does it mean to weigh up these potentially conflicting views, Wimmer's critical take, versus more conventional views of alliances and international relations?
Yeah, definitely some food for thought there.
It certainly is. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive.